In recent media interviews, the Treasurer Jim Chalmers has raved about a new non-fiction book by two American journalists called Abundance.
Ezra Klein and Thompson's book, Abundance, has been doing the rounds. And it argues that regulatory barriers...
We should be on a commission with these guys.
Regulatory barriers and bureaucratic inertia are stifling the construction of new housing.
The book has been hailed by some as a manifesto for the Democrats. So why has it got Australian Labor MPs so excited? And in a fragile world, is building more the answer? Today, editor Lenore Taylor and head of Newsroom Mike Ticher on if the abundance agenda is right for Australia. Lenore, Mike, it's great to have you in the studio.
Good morning, Nour.
Morning, Nour.
Lenore, what is abundance and why are politicians and journalists in Canberra talking about it?
Well, sometimes there's a book that everybody has to say they've read, whether they've read it or they haven't read it. It's one of those books. It's written by two, very famous journalists in the US, but it's being cited here a lot in the run-up to the productivity summit that Jim Chalmers is having. I think it's fair to say that on the Labor side, people are quite excited about it because it's basically advocating a kind of, remember the third way? Like we've had a couple of third ways by now, but that sort of path between socialist left and authoritarian right, like somewhere down the middle, which is where, Australian Labor likes to position itself. It bills itself as that. I have questions about it, I've got to say, about whether the arguments entirely stack up and to what extent they're transferable to Australia. But that's the gist of it. It's the book you've got to pretend you've read. I actually have read most of it.
Okay.
But
well, full disclaimer.
Haven't quite finished it. But and it's interesting. Like it's a good read. It's an interesting read. It has some interesting ideas, but I think there's questions too.
Well, full disclaimer, I've not read it, and neither has the Prime Minister, I believe, but
Jim Chalmers sure has.
I have read plenty of commentary about it, and Chalmers is raving about it too. So, Lenore, what is the argument that is put forward in Abundance?
Okay, to sort of grossly simplify it, it's basically that if you cut regulations and policies that jam up construction and innovation, then governments can build more stuff like more houses and more energy and more infrastructure, and voters are going to like that, and that the left needs to kind of have a good long hard look at itself because it has, for good reasons, advocated regulations that might jam up those processes, and that might be part of the reason why people are losing faith in politics because stuff isn't working. That's kind of it's more complicated than that, but that's kind of the gist. It's basically get rid of regulations and let stuff happen.
Yeah, it's explicitly aimed at a progressive audience in the US and arguing that regulation, including controversially environmental regulation in some cases, has basically stopped progressive governments in the US from getting stuff done, like big infrastructure projects.
And they cite some pretty convincing examples.
They do.
Yeah.
Particularly aimed at states where Democrats have been in power at many levels, if not all levels, for some time, California in particular, and trying to analyse why they've been so unsuccessful in getting stuff done.
I guess really, if I'm self-reflective, my starting point cynicism is that we have had so many, like pretty much every opposition that's ever been says, I'm going to cut red tape and I'm going to, save a gazillion
of the regulations.
a gazillion dollars. Labor did it in 2007. Then, as Mike says, Tony Abbott was going to set a bonfire of red tape. It's the panacea that really isn't a panacea, because the minute you get into any of these discussions, it always gets complicated. And sometimes regulations might be justifiably, from my point of view, I guess it's in the eye of the beholder, called red tape. And sometimes we need them to have buildings that don't fall down and people driving on the right side of the road or things that, environment that's clean. So, and I guess the authors of the book aren't arguing against all regulation. Like they still think they need a Clean Air Act or a minimum wage, but they are quite clearly not so keen on what sounds like the US equivalent of environmental impact statements, for instance. Well, personally, my view is environmental impact statements serve a pretty good purpose. So that's a discussion, but it's not a discussion that can be had at we've got to get rid of red tape level. It's like, what does it do? What's it good for? What's it holding up? You need to get down into the detail, which is kind of my problem with the discussion.
Yeah, they're not advocating for Elon Musk style.
No, they're not.
Slashing willy-nilly. And it is a nuanced argument. They go into a lot of detail about what kind of regulation, the layers of regulation that to some extent have delayed and held up projects.
And no one would really argue the US political system's efficient.
No, but yeah, there are many cases where there's a very clear need for regulation. We can probably go into some of those. And others where, yes, things, that we do have a problem with getting things done efficiently and cheaply compared to past experience.
I am keen to talk about some of the criticisms and critiques of this agenda. But before we get to that, essentially Klein and Thompson, they're arguing that in the US context, rather than fretting about scarcity or scarce resources, policymakers need to ensure that more houses, more public transportation, more power plants, more infrastructure is built. In the Australian context, what is standing in the way of that?
Well, I go back to my previous answer. You need to separate them out. It is complicated. So if you look at housing, for instance, I think there is some applicability of those arguments. I think there are some supply side impediments to building houses in Australia. It's pretty clear that we're not building enough houses. We saw this week some inadvertently released Treasury advice, which was telling the government pretty clearly that their goal of building 1.2 million houses just isn't going to happen. And some of that is planning regulation, and some of that is, things that have just stopped us or slowed the building of houses even as we need them more. There's also solutions coming out, like the Chris Minns government in New South Wales this week released a sort of like templated architect designs that you can get for $1 and get your approval real fast because it's a template. That's a great idea. Like, that cuts through regulation. On the other hand, some of what the property development industry would say is red tape is actually thinking about what species you might be making extinct by clear felling for housing. And that has to be taken into account as well. And also, we know that there are demand side issues in our housing market that are really problematic as well, like negative gearing and capital gains tax, that have really turbocharged prices here and made houses here even less affordable than in the United States. So I think that's one example where, yeah, it kind of applies, it doesn't quite apply, and look at where all the vested interests are coming from because it's complicated.
And there are some regulations in housing particularly that make sense on a sort of efficiency basis as well, because they bake in longer-term savings, like demanding standards on insulation, for example, effective heating,
colours,
solar panels, et cetera, those kind of things that pay off in the long term have to be regulated. Otherwise, it's cheaper to build without them in some cases, and people will do that. As we've discussed, they're not saying all regulation is bad.
But I think there's
you do
a
have
danger that it's
tease out the bits
way,
that are and are not, and that's extremely complicated.
Yeah, guardrails, brakes on some of these projects is important. What about our natural world? Can we pursue abundance whilst preserving our natural world, the environment, natural resources?
Well, this sort of goes to one of the, critiques and things at the guts of this book, which is it fully rejects the degrowth agenda. It says we can grow, we should grow, we need to grow, people need stuff, they need houses. That's fine. We have the wherewithal and the technology to do it. We've just got to get regulation out of the way. Let's say we accept that argument. I personally sort of do accept that argument. You need to get into the complicated debates about this. So we've just been through in Australia a whole review of our environmental laws, of our nature laws, because on the one hand, we do have an extinction crisis. We are the extinction capital of the world, and it is by every assessment a problem. On the other hand, many developments, many industries are arguing that environmental regulations are getting in the way. So there was a proper review of this. There was recommendations. The government went through the whole process of putting forward laws. And then right at the last minute, because industry and one particular state got in the way, the whole thing got shelved. And now we don't have any review of those laws. So, the abundance agenda is all well and good, but it hits hard up against stakeholders in the political agenda, like our nature laws did before the last election.
In many ways, I felt abundance was a curious term to use to describe what they're getting at, because we live in many parts of the world, we live in the most abundant times ever in terms of the amount of stuff that we have. And they do say in the book, we have a startling abundance of the goods that fill a house, but a shortage of what's needed to build a good life.
Like a house.
Yes, like a house itself. But the creation of that actual abundance that we already have of cheap consumer goods, electronic goods, fast fashion, all these kind of things where we have so much more in our lives in the rich Western world than we have any humans have ever had before in history, seems a slightly odd way to start your argument about how we should be recalibrating arguments on the left about how to frame our economic policies. It's true that not everyone has all those things, and there are some things that are scarce for reasons, as Lenore's just outlined, that are not just about producing them, in housing particularly. But yeah, there are clearly environmental disasters, workplace disasters, terrible workplace conditions, all kinds of other horrors that have emanated from just a sort of unregulated drive towards producing more and more things. And that seemed a slightly odd way to pitch it to me.
But I guess it might make more sense in the US context than in our context, because in the US, I guess the progressive side of politics is trying to find a way to move away from the sort of MAGA framing that they're scolds and naysayers and people who only care about culture wars, and they're not caring about the material well-being of people, and trying to kind of reset that debate. This framing might work. In Australia, we just had a progressive government re-elected in a landslide that is actually kind of already more or less going down this centrist path. So to us, the framing looks, through our lens, the framing looks less explicable, I guess, than possibly through a US lens.
One left-leaning magazine in the US called it neoliberalism repackaged for a post-neoliberal world. Some critics argue that the abundance agenda would lead to more inequality. Are these reforms and expanding welfare mutually exclusive?
I don't think they are, and I don't think it's exactly what they're saying, but I think it's pretty clear that inequality is not productive, doesn't help productivity. And I think that's something that I'm hoping the Productivity Roundtable in Australia will look at. I hope inequality advocates will get a seat at the table, because there's clear evidence, for example, that if job seeker sits well below the poverty line, as it still does, the economic output, if that's how you want to measure it, is reduced because people have fewer chances of getting jobs. They don't have good mental health. Their lives are diminished. The healthcare system is more relied upon. The increasing gap between the very wealthy and the sort of middle class or working class, I think, is also unproductive, because the middle class are the people who, if you're an economist, you want to buy things. And if they haven't got enough money, they're not going to buy things. And, the very wealthy will, stack their money away. The people who are living normal lives are going to spend their money. So in terms of economic growth and productivity, you could argue that worsening wealth inequality is also unproductive. I hope those arguments get a seat at the table, because I think they're quite important.
And in relation to housing in particular, it's now about generational inequality as well as just income. One thing I do think is interesting, and perhaps this is what Chalmers somewhat picks up on, and others who are keen on the ideas expressed in abundance, is that it's as much about a mind shift on the progressive side towards outcomes rather than processes. And I think we've seen a good example of state governments in recent years where they have achieved really big infrastructure projects, not within budget or within the time frame, but transport projects in particular. The Sydney Metro that was extended last year to much acclaim, and the public found that really a surprising and in the Australian context and welcome contribution. Government gets things done. And I think governments that can achieve those kind of projects will get a benefit from it, I think. And that's, I think, where the book is heading to some extent, is just kind of shifting the framework of thinking from are the processes we're setting in stone the right ones to what are we actually
like a kind of eyes on the prize
Exactly.
mentality. Yeah.
So as Lenore's mentioned a couple of times, the Treasurer will be hosting these productivity roundtables, pulling together people from various industries to look at some of these issues that we've been talking about. How much will abundance be on the agenda? What is on the agenda? And could it yield any results?
I don't know if it's going to yield any results, to be honest. I think when it comes to productivity, it's kind of like a political Rorschach test in that everyone sees what they want to see or puts what they want to happen in that framing. So there's the Productivity Commission's conducting a series of reviews ahead of this roundtable. You will be shocked to know that business is arguing that lower company taxes are the most productive thing you can do. There's a lot of evidence that suggests that's not the case. That's what they're arguing. Although, interestingly, this week, the Commonwealth Bank actually said that shouldn't be a priority, lower company tax. So they sort of broke from the Business Council of Australia, which I thought was interesting. I think the AI companies are in like Flynn. They're saying, they're already kind of hoovering up all the creative work and hoovering up a whole lot of jobs, but they are arguing, unsurprisingly, that productivity will be massively enhanced by AI, may well be true, and that there should be no regulations pretty much on it at all. Problematic in my view. So that's another argument. So I think, it's like any of these political things. Everyone will come with their own self-interest, and it's a matter of how well the Treasurer distills those arguments and comes up with something that, meets the complexity that sits underneath all of this.
Problematic is probably a bit of an understatement. Mike, having these big ideas is one thing. Executing them is another. It can be contentious and it can be risky for governments. Can Labor do that this term, embark on some of these,
I think the big test
reforms
of whether they can was the clean energy transition, which is something that is also talked about at length in Abundance. They're trying to drive through a huge change to the energy infrastructure in this country. It does involve impinging on what people see as their private property rights in some cases, driving transmission lines across farmland, etc. Large wind farms. Large wind farms that people in many cases don't like. You could argue that getting rid of regulation and, sweeping aside those NIMBY-ish arguments is going to achieve it quicker and more effectively, and that may well be true. But it's something where, oddly, the right is actually now arguing in favour of the regulations and the NIMBYism, and the left isn't. So, I mean, I think that's the classic example where that will be the proof of the pudding will be in the eating in that case. How far they get, how quickly they get there, how efficiently and with what political cost.
In a note of optimism, the Labor Party has this huge majority and a big wad of political capital to spend, and they can spend it on getting these things right, on trying to make the right decisions to bring the community with them, and to sort of really, I think the book is in line with the direction that they want to go. I think that's why they're so excited about it. But unlike America, they are in power and they've got the political capital to do it.
Okay, it's now time for what we can't get out of our head. Lenore, what was it for you?
Oh, I have this morbid or kind of weird fascination in President Trump's fight with his own MAGA base over the so-called Epstein files. I mean, if you believe in just desserts, this one is a smorgasbord. Trump supporters and Trump himself have promoted this conspiracy theory that the deep state actually killed Epstein and that there's some kind of secret file with a long list of Democrats and other liberal figures on it who somehow did some terrible things. Now, I don't know if there is a list or there isn't. I really don't know. However, he got into power, so then he has the power now to release the list, which the MAGA base asked him to do. And then the Department of Justice said, no, there's no list. The MAGA base can't believe it. So now they don't know quite what to do. Like, what is Donald Trump part of the deep state? I don't know. And they're really attacking him. So now he's attacking them and calling his own base stupid and weaklings. And now he's saying the whole idea right from the start was a hoax propagated by the Democrats. I mean, I couldn't make this up.
Well, there you go. We'll probably never get to the bottom of it. And Mike, what was it for you?
I really loved a story that Sian Kane did for us this week, where she went to interview a guy in Melbourne who has made a living out of making tiny, teeny models of popular music venues in Melbourne. And it was just one of those stories where it had no point. You know, what he does has no point except the sheer joy of doing it, the aesthetic appeal of doing it. People love looking at them, but it's kind of completely analog. Like, it couldn't be further removed from the world of AI and tech that seems to dominate our lives so much these days. He's just making this with his stuff with his hands for the sheer beauty of it, and that really appealed to me, that aspect of it. And he's also made a huge success of it, and other people love it. So, and it was a really beautifully written story as well. So, I urge people to check that one out.
Don't we need more of that in our lives? Mike, Lenore, thanks so much.
Thanks.